So much for joining. It's a great number of you on this call today, and I can see from the names that we have a great variety of people, hopefully from all over the world. Thanks to those of you who are already saying hello in the chat. Feel free to introduce yourselves to each other. Say who you are and where you're from. It's not compulsory, but if you want to introduce yourself to the group, please do. I'll introduce myself a bit more in a moment, but I just wanted to start by letting you know what we're hoping to achieve today. I will start by saying that it's not going to be a language class, I'm afraid. And by the end of this, I would be really surprised if you would be amazing fluent speakers of English if you're not already. So we're not aiming to improve your linguistic ability much by the end of this, but hopefully raise your awareness around certain topics that will really help you in your communications in English. So this is what we're looking to achieve today. We're going to start by looking at the concept of global English. It might be new to some of you. It might be something that a lot of you know very much about already. And we'll look at what this means in the global world that we're living in, and especially in international business. We're also going to look at some of the issues around speaking English. Some of these are technical linguistic issues, and some of these are emotional human issues. And that emotional side, that human side, is something that a lot of people quite often forget. But language is an expression of ourselves, it's an expression of who we are, and therefore it really connects to our emotions. So we're going to talk a little bit about those emotional and human factors as well as we go along. And finally, we're going to look at some practical tips and strategies, things that you can do to become a more effective global communicator in English. So that's what we're hoping to do today. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. We've got a great spread here. We've got France, Switzerland, Italy here, Saudi, Portugal. Well, huge amount of people. India, Czech Republic. This is great. We have a great mix of people and a huge amount of experience in the room. So I would really encourage you to share your experiences as we go through this webinar. So I wanted to ask a little bit about you, find out who is here in the room with us. Before we go into the couple of polls that we have here, I just wanted to say a word about the terms I'm going to be using today. I'm going to be using the terms native speaker and non-native speaker. Now, I personally don't really like these terms because they are quite often connected with some kind of value judgment about your ability to speak English. However, I really want to separate that out. The way I want to use native and non-native today is the way our brains process language. The way native speakers of a language and non-native speakers of a language process the language is very different, and we have very different experiences of our own native languages than we do of our foreign languages. So when I say a native speaker, I'm not making any assumptions that you might be a good communicator in English or that you speak English well. It's just the way your brain processes it would be very different from someone who might have learnt it later in life. So I just wanted to clarify that, and I will be using the terms native and non-native. So I think we're going to open up our first poll to see who is in the room here. Thank you for opening that up, Kathy. So we have here, if you could just check which describes you. Are you a native speaker of English? Are you a second language speaker of English? So these are people who maybe grew up speaking another language, but maybe studied English in school, or their schooling was in English, and their countries speak English as maybe a formal language, or a foreign language speaker of English. So people who've come to English later in life. Okay, great. And we've got quite a big split in the room here. Lots of people who are foreign language speakers. Nearly 60% of you are foreign language speakers. That's great. Great to hear. A few second language speakers of English and a small minority of native English speakers. That is very interesting. We'll touch on this later. I would have liked to have seen more native speakers in this workshop, as you will see as we go on. Another interesting point might be how many languages you speak. So again, we have another poll. So including English, how many languages do you feel you can speak to a competent level? You can have a good communication in them, a good conversation in them. 1, 2, 3, or even 4 or more. Okay, these are coming in. Seems that 2 and 3 have it. 3 languages. Okay. Great. So we've got a good split there between people who speak 2 languages or people who speak 3 languages. Great to have you in the room. A small minority of people that speak 4 or more. That's impressive. And a proportion who speak, I'm guessing, just English as their main language of communication. So great to have a good mix in the room. I would love to hear, as we go through, experiences from all of you. You all have valid experiences and valid points of view to put across. So please feel free to share in the chat. Great. So thank you for that. So I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to myself to tell you why it's me here speaking to you today. But while I'm doing that, I'd like you to think about the term global English and maybe use the text tools that that Kathy showed you before on the left-hand side of the screen. Type anything you like, anything that comes to mind about global English, the characteristics of global English, what it means to you. So while I'm giving my introduction, please feel free to type on that slide anywhere. So I am a native English speaker. I come from the UK, and I am also a speaker of other languages. So I speak German. I studied German at school and at university, so textbook learning, and I speak Japanese. I learned Japanese like a child, actually. I surrounded myself with people who speak Japanese in a Japanese community, and I basically copied what they said and did, and I learned language as a child would, although I was an adult. So I understand what it's like to be both a native speaker of English and what it's like to have the difficulty of communicating in a foreign language. I'm also a qualified English teacher. My first ever job was an English language teacher in Japan. And I was very proud of myself at the time when I first qualified that I knew English grammar inside out, and I was very strong on phonics. I could show you how to form the 12 British English vowel sounds. Yeah, I was very proud of that. And that's how I taught English for a number of years until I came across an organization in Japan that was set up to create connections between people from other countries, connections and understanding between people from other countries. And I suddenly saw these people, mainly from Japan, going out into the world and communicating with people from Vietnam, from Thailand, from Kenya, from Canada, in a form of English that I had never taught in the classroom, but it was communicative English. It was real, genuine communication. And that's when I first encountered global English, and I was fascinated by it. Just seen, thank you for Sandrine for saying my English is very clear. Thank you for that. Yeah, so I became fascinated in global English about 15 years ago, and I've used the concept in my work life over the past 15 years when I've been managing multinational teams. And I see that global English, one of the key issues around global English is this difference between the way native speakers understand a language on one hand and non-native speak on the other hand, and it's that gap between them. Perhaps some of you have had an experience where you've been in a multinational situation, you've been speaking to a lot of other non-native speakers, and then a native speaker comes to join you, and suddenly the understanding level goes down rather than up. Have any of you had that experience before? This is what fascinated me in the multinational teams that I work with, the negative impact that that native speakers can have on a non-native communication situation. So that's what we're going to be talking about. I'm just going to go over to the slide here that you've been filling in. An English that everyone can understand. Yes, that is very much it. An English that is accessible to everyone. Slower pace, maybe. Slower pace is maybe a more measured pace, yeah, of English. It's one of the characteristics of global English. English which is spoken in a way that can be easily understood by non-native speakers. That's true, but I would also include native speakers in there. So global English is an English that is understood both by non-natives and natives equally. Variety of accents, yes. Just as native English has a variety of accents, global English has an even greater variety of accents. Less colloquial language, yes, that's a very important point, and we'll come to that later. And this idea of simplified in a way, but not less clear, I would say. And we've got one final one there. English is quality style of writing which non-native speakers easily and clearly understand. Yes, great. So these are great descriptions of the characteristics of global English. We've got a couple in the chat there. Fewer idioms and contextual references. Yes, that's very true, and we'll touch on those in a moment. So thank you for those. So to kick us off, we're going to start, before we dive into the detail, we're going to start with a quiz. So very quickly, either on the slides or in the chat, please tell me what is wrong with these sentences. I were watching TV last night. Yous are amazing. I am not understanding it. And touch base when you get in. So let's have a look here. Yeah, we've got some answers coming in. Understand, yep. Okay, so you seem to have some corrections for the top one here. It's very, very interesting. So I was watching TV last night. So yeah, in a language class, we would learn that I, the past tense form of to be that goes with I is I was. So I were is incorrect. That's what we'd learn in an English class. But if I spoke to you in a northern English accent, so maybe some from Manchester, and I said to you, I were watching TV last night, that would be perfectly acceptable English here in the UK. Grammatically incorrect, but thousands and thousands of people in this country would use that. Native speakers would use that and not consider it incorrect. So next one, you're amazing, yous are amazing. So yep, you are amazing is correct, you're amazing is correct. Used, so English doesn't have a second person plural. Some languages do, German does, for example. You can say you in the plural in German. In English we don't. But this, again, people in Ireland, people in Australia, they'd be quite happy using yous to mean a number of people. So again, in certain native contexts, yous can be correct. I'm not understanding it. I don't understand. Now, this is quite popular in one of the countries that has the the largest population of English speakers, one of the largest populations of English speakers in the world, India. Yes, exactly. Very, very common. In a language classroom, we would be told that verbs like understand, love, think, maybe not think, but verbs to do with feeling and concepts cannot be put with an ing. They can't be in the present participle. That's what we're told in the classroom. But what about McDonald's? I'm loving it. Their famous catchphrase. Are they wrong? Who's to say? And the final one, touch base when you get in. Now, grammatically, I can't find anything wrong with that. But I think the person who wrote touch what really describes that well. Touch base means to make contact, to contact me, for example. When you get in, get what? Get in? When you arrive, maybe. So contact me when you arrive, I would say, would be much more communicative, much more easy to understand. But this idiom, touch base, which is quite common in lots of corporate settings, can really get in the way of communication here. So I think what I'm trying to show you with this slide is that what we feel we should be doing in terms of speaking English, especially as non-native speakers, is not necessarily the same as how native speakers speak it. It's almost, it feels unfair. It's like you're playing a game, but not everyone is playing by the same rules. It's like you're playing football, but the native speakers are allowed to use their hands and the non-native speakers aren't allowed to use their hands. So why are we trying to achieve linguistic perfection? Why are non-native speakers trying to achieve linguistic perfection when native speakers don't do it? So this is a major part of global English. I'm going to give you now a bit of just a very quick overview of the English language as it's spoken around the world, and I'm going to use a very simple diagram. It might be a bit too simple, a very simple model of English as it's spoken around the world. This was a model that a man called Kachru came up with in the 1980s. And he split the world into 3 circles of English language. So he had what he called the inner circle. These are the first language speakers of English. These are the natives, if you like. So this is people living in the UK, in the US, Canada, Australia, all of these countries where English is the main language of communication. And he put them at the center of the circle. The next circle he mentioned was the outer circle. This is the circle of countries quite often that had a colonial presence, where English became a second language or an official language. So where people might speak their own local language at home, but the language of school and government might be English. So we've got places like India, places like Singapore, places like Kenya. These are all second language kind of places in the world. And these have led to great dialects growing up, great, very influential dialects growing up in English. So Indian English has become a very powerful and influential form of English that has actually started influencing some native speakers here. Singlish is a very well established form of Singaporean English with its own characteristics. So that's what Kachru called the outer circle. And then he mentioned that, Scott, I just seen you put Wales. Yeah, yes, maybe. Yes, and the expanding circle is where English is spoken as a foreign language. So it's not part of government, it's not part of education, but people learn English as a foreign language in these countries. So we're talking Japan, we're talking China, Korea, maybe we're talking most of Latin America here as well. So lots of countries in this expanding circle. And what was interesting was the numbers. Now I've chosen these numbers are very rough, and Kachru gave a very broad spectrum of numbers. I've chosen the upper limits. Don't focus too much on the numbers here. Focus on the proportions. So around 350, 400 million native speakers in the world. And I think what we can say safely is there are more second language speakers of English in the world. But what is really impressive, sorry, that is quite difficult to read, but that says 1 billion down there, up to 1 billion foreign language speakers of English in the world. And what I wanted to illustrate with this is that native speakers are very much in the minority when it comes to English language. There are so many more speakers of English as a foreign language around the world. And yet we still strive for that native standard of English learning. Why do we do that? When only 1 in 4, 1 in 5 English speakers in the world is a native, why do we set ourselves that goal of attaining a native standard? And this is where global English comes in. A lot of companies now, a lot of non-native English companies, so companies based in France, in Japan, in Germany, are adopting English as their global language. And they are not necessarily interested in native English. They're interested in English as a form of communication. So people who can speak global English and can communicate well, regardless of what circle you come from. This is where global English comes in to bridge all of these circles, to ensure that everyone, regardless of where they are in these circles, can communicate well with each other. So rather than define English, I just wanted to quickly whiz through a couple of the characteristics of global English. You've touched on many of them already. It's clear, it's concise, it's explicit, and therefore, because it doesn't use these contextual cues, it's very accessible to everyone. It's flexible and adaptable. So whether you are a Chinese person speaking to someone in Brazil, or whether you are a Palestinian speaking to someone from Russia, the English that you use as global English will be different, and that's fine. It's adaptable. The global English you use will change depending on the audience that you're working with. So that is a characteristic. And because of this, there's no fixed grammar. There's no fixed vocabulary. Everything is decided in the moment. If I understand it and you understand it, it doesn't matter if it's right, or it doesn't matter if the grammar is correct. So there is no fixed grammar book, and there is no fixed vocabulary. And because of that, it's owned by anyone. The English I speak and have been speaking for the past 40-something years is no more correct and no more valid than the English of an English language learner who's only been speaking the language for 5 years. So it's owned by anyone. And if it's owned by anyone, you can use it how you want. So it's this idea of empowerment of global English. I can speak English how I want as long as we understand each other. And finally, because of that, it's less of a language and more of a state of mind. So what we're going to be talking about here today is English as a state of mind. So why bother with learning global English? This was mainly towards the focus towards the native speakers. But it rings true of non-natives as well. It's efficient. as a native speaker, if you learn to communicate well in very clear, concise global English, you're going to, you won't have to learn another language, spend years learning another language. And it's efficient for non-natives to have this concept of global English in their mind, the concepts that we just talked about, because you don't have to be tied to getting the grammar right every time. You don't have to waste your time with vocabulary lists. As long as the communication works, then you can be happy with it, and that's efficient. Global English, if it's spoken well between two people who are really trying to communicate with each other, reduces misunderstandings, and that saves time and it saves effort. And it reduces this difference that I talked about between the way native speakers process language and non-natives, and puts people on a similar level so that they can understand the language in the same way. It means that native speakers are going to have to make an effort to think about the language that they're using in the same way that non-native speakers always do. But that cognitive processing, that active thought about the language we're using, means that that distance that difference is lessened. And finally, the psychological impact. When you're speaking with someone who you don't understand, it can be very draining. If I'm going to do business with someone, I would like to do business with someone who it's easy to communicate with. So if I, as a native speaker, don't adjust my language to make it easy for non-native speakers to understand, the non-native speakers aren't going to want to communicate with me, and therefore I won't succeed in business. So these are a few reasons of why we should bother with learning global English. I just wanted to take a moment to get some thoughts from you. So there are many benefits of speaking English in a global context. I'd like you to imagine that you are working for a global company that has chosen English as its language of communication. Now, what do you think the benefits are for native speakers and for non-native speakers of speaking English as this language of communication? And also, what do you think the challenges are for the native speaker and for the non-native speakers? So have a think. Imagine yourself in a company where English is the global language, where your colleagues all speak English, where your meetings are all conducted in English, your phone calls are all conducted in English. What are the benefits for the natives and the non-natives, and what are the challenges for the natives and the non-natives? Feel free to fill in the chart there. I'll give you a second to write some ideas in there. Better understanding. Yeah, native speakers quite often feel that they understand more, and better understanding also in non-native as a benefit. That's interesting. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit in the non-native section. Better understanding in the non-native section. What do you mean by that? Okay, one of the challenges for native speakers is being aware. Whoever tells them. So yeah, one of the challenges for native speakers is they quite often don't know about the difficulties of speaking another language. Wow, lots of challenges for the native speakers here. Quite difficult to see here. Adapting the vocabulary. Yep, if you're not used to adapting your vocabulary, it's quite difficult. Feel like we're speaking our language properly. Yes, so there can be a kind of an emotional challenge to native speakers who feel like, I'm already speaking this properly. Why should I change? Can you think of any challenges that non-native speakers face? Just trying to work out some of these. Let me move some. Okay, slower communication. Yeah. Where are the rules for improving language level? May not understand local accents. Yes, this is very true. Slower communication. Afraid to use the wrong word. So yeah, this fear of getting it wrong, saying the wrong thing. Exactly, and not being being afraid to tell the native speakers when we don't understand. It's a really big barrier. Okay, great. A lot of comments there. I'm going to quickly whiz through because we're slightly behind on time. But thank you for all of those. Here are some of the responses that I quite often get, and the ones that I'd like to focus on is an overlooked issue for native speakers is people can sometimes feel embarrassed that they don't speak another language. And so this is quite an emotional strain for some native speakers as well. And for non-native speakers, one thing that native speakers quite often don't understand is how tiring it can be to constantly think in another language, and how much you lose your personality. You might be quite a fun person in your native language, but you might not have the language ability to let that come across in your non-native language. So it can be quite draining and demoralizing for non-native speakers. But not to focus on the negative, let's focus on the positive. What can we do about this? How can we get better at communicating in English? So we're going to take a quick look through some technical strategies. So these are strategies that focus on the language side of things. How can we change the language we use to make it easier for others to understand, whether they're native speakers or non-native speakers? And then we're going to look at very briefly at the non-technical strategies. So this is the human, emotional side of things. So the first area that you can focus on, especially as a native speaker, is one that's come up quite often already. This idea of the words you choose, the vocabulary you use. Most English language lessons are taken up with learning the words of a language and how to fit them together. So as native speakers, we can make things so much more easy to understand by choosing our words carefully. And the first big one here that many of you have already looked at is idiom. Now, idiom is a set phrase that quite often conveys a complicated meaning in a very simple way. And the reason people use idioms is to add color to their language, to add variety, but also because it's a way of getting from point A to point B very quickly. If you're speaking with someone who understands the idiom, they understand exactly what you mean very quickly. So as you can see with this path, you can get from point A to point B without going all the way around the outside. So you can convey meanings very quickly and very easily. However, the problem is we forget what idiom is. We use these things so much that these paths get so well worn in our brains that we forget how to express the same idea by going round that long way of the path, by using longer words to express the same idea. And so we use idioms without thinking about it quite often as native speakers. So we've got some examples here of idioms. It'd be interesting to see in the chat whether you've seen any of these before, whether you can understand them, and how easy they are to understand. Can you rephrase them in a way that conveys the same meaning, but in a more simple way? So his idea was a complete no-brainer. Her comment came out of left field. It does what it says on the tin. Thank you for reaching out. And let's get the ball rolling. Yes, a no-brainer. Apart from many people misunderstand this, but it's something that is very obvious and very obviously correct or very obviously right. It's an idea that of course we should do because it's so obvious. So you don't even need a brain to understand how good it is. Left field, yeah. So this is a sporting analogy. Lots of British and American idioms come from sports. So when a ball comes to you from left field in cricket or in baseball, it's a surprise. Um, does what it says in the tin. See, this is a very British cultural uh, idiom that comes from a TV commercial from the 1990s, and it just means, yeah, it does exactly what you think it would do. It fulfills its needs in just a simple but effective way. Reaching out. This is business slang, business jargon, business speak, if you like. And it's this horrible term. I really don't like it for connecting with someone, to get in contact with someone. So, but this idea of reaching out, yeah, I'm not a fan of that. And get the ball rolling. Yes, it means to start. So native speakers will often use these without thinking about them. They'll throw them into conversation without thinking about them. The first thing that you can do as a native speaker is become more aware of the words you're using. If you record meetings, listen back. It's horrible to listen to your own voice, but listen back and see if you've used any of these in your meetings. Look back at your emails before you send them and say, have I written any idioms in here that people might not understand? And what non-native speakers can do about this is ask. If someone says something that you don't understand that you think is an idiom, ask. It's much better to ask and to interrupt and say, what do you mean by that? Than to let it go without you understanding what's being said. Misunderstanding or lack of understanding is the one thing that we're trying to avoid here. And also, it could provide you with some interesting cultural insight, but most importantly, it could highlight to the native speaker that you're speaking to that they need to change the way they speak. So, as non-natives, we have kind of a bit of a responsibility to educate the native speakers that we speak to into getting them to speak global English and speak more clearly with fewer fewer idioms. So I don't want to dwell on that much. I can see that there's a lot of sharing here. Yes, Scott, many native speakers are unaware of what an idiom is. Like I say, we're not aware that we use them at all. It's like I often equate it to yoga. We all breathe every day, but until you do yoga, you really don't understand that you're breathing well or not well. So raising the awareness is one of the biggest points here. I'm going to move us on quite quickly. We're going to stay in the area of vocabulary, but what we're looking at here is synonyms. English is a fantastically rich language. It has many synonyms, words with the same meaning or words with similar meanings that have a slightly different nuance. And I've got some examples here. So synonyms for big, you've got, these are just some of them. And native speakers will pick the one that they think most precisely fits the feeling that they're trying to convey. However, as non-native speakers, you probably only learnt a small selection of words to express a single idea. And if a native speaker selects one of the synonyms that you haven't heard before, then you lose the meaning. So if you were going to be speaking in a multinational context, using English, using global English, and you wanted to express something that was very big, which of these words would you use? So mark on the screen which you would use. There are certain words there that I would definitely avoid. Huge, okay, someone for huge there. huge, large. Yeah, I think that's about it. I would use, I probably wouldn't even use huge, to be honest. I would probably use big and I would use large. So, as a native speaker, if you wanted to say, oh, it was a gigantic problem, that gives a feeling of really, really big. But why don't you just say it was a really, really big problem? Um, so native speakers can do a lot by choosing their words carefully. They can really help the understanding by choosing their words carefully, and not just native speakers. In an international context, you will probably be interacting with people whose English level is a lot higher than yours or a lot lower than yours. So even as non-native speakers, we have to gauge the level of our audience and choose the right words for that audience. My general rule is stick to the simple words, stick to big and large. Everything else you can add in afterwards, but those are the ones that convey the meaning. So when you're thinking of synonyms, be careful, keep it simple, would be my general advice there for global English. Moving on, sorry, I just need to catch up with my notes here. So verbs, verbs. Again, choosing the right words. Quite often native English speakers will select words that they think are easy for people to understand, but in reality are quite difficult. And one example I've got here is the example of phrasal verbs. So verbs that you make up from a verb stem and another small word. So get, we all know what get means. It means to receive, to acquire, to obtain. But when you connect get to another word, it it can take on many meanings. Get over something, get on with something, get at. These I'm not going to take time to go through all of the meanings here. Put is similar. Put something off. Put someone down. Put someone out. Um, Native speakers quite often rely on these phrasal verbs because they sound quite informal. Um, they informal language can quite often be intended to build rapport with someone. If I'm not speaking formally with you, it means that I probably want to build a personal relationship with you, and therefore I'll choose my language to be more personal and build that rapport. But native speakers quite often don't understand that this simple sounding language is actually very difficult. So yeah, I can see in the chat that yeah, these are things that the non-native speakers have difficulty with. If you have difficulty with it, check the meaning. Ask, what do you mean by that? If you mean put something off until next week, do you mean delay? Okay, yes, you mean delay. Native speakers, you will find, are not good at rephrasing things in their own language, quite strangely. So if you can rephrase for them and check the meaning, that will help them, and it will also help you with your understanding. So rephrasing when it comes to verbs that are difficult. And for native speakers, the advice would be just because something feels easy to you, it could be that a more complex sounding word might be more accessible to non-native speakers. Yeah, informality does not equal clarity necessarily. So you might feel like you want to speak informally, but most people in their language classes don't learn informal English. They learn formal English. So in a global English context, speaking slightly more formally will often be easier to understand. So I'm going to skip ahead slightly here and take a look at accent. How many of you feel good? No, how many of you feel bad, feel embarrassed about your accent when you speak English? Anyone? Yeah, we've got a couple of people putting their hands up in the chat. Yeah. Okay, some people. What I would say is embrace your accent. Go with it. Don't be embarrassed by it. What your accent is telling people is that you didn't come to this language easily by being born into it. It took you time and effort to get to where you are. So embrace it. Be proud of it. It's part of your identity. When I moved to Japan, I lived in the north of Japan in a very rural area. And as I mentioned, I didn't learn Japanese from textbooks. I copied from the people around me. And it took me about 2 years to realize that I spoke with a very rural Japanese accent. And when I moved to Tokyo, people were fascinated by this foreigner who spoke Japanese with a farmer's accent. Um, and I was proud of that. That became my identity. I was the country boy who had experienced part of Japanese life that a lot of people in Tokyo hadn't experienced. So be proud of your accent and embrace it, but embrace it loosely. And what I mean by that is get to know your accent. Get to know what the difficulties are that people have with your accent. So when you're speaking, do they frown slightly? Do they put their head on their side? Are they finding you difficult to understand? Get an outside view. Ask people, is my accent understandable? Can you point out when you don't understand my accent? My partner, she's Japanese, and she's quite happy to point out when my accent gets in the way of communication when I'm speaking Japanese to her. And it's really useful. It makes me feel a bit angry at times, but it does help my communication. So be proud of your accent. Don't try and get rid of it, but also understand it and understand the problems that it can cause other people. Get feedback on your accent and try to adapt it where possible. And pronunciation. A lot of language students spend a lot of time trying to master certain sounds in English. Not all sounds are created equal. So for example, the TH sound, the th sound. I know that a lot of my students in Japan found this very difficult to cope with. But I know native English speakers, native British people who don't pronounce their THs. They say I think instead of I think, or they say this instead of this. So if native speakers don't do it, why should non-native speakers do it? However, some sounds are very important where they provide clarity. So I think of the T sound, the t, 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 very important to get that clear in global English context because it adds clarity to the word. In Britain, you might hear people talk about water instead of water, or you might hear people say what instead of what. That T adds a clarity. In American English, you can hear people say can and can't. Is that can or can't? I'm not sure. So that T can really add to it. So yes, think about your pronunciation, but don't worry about it too much. And look at the people you're talking to be able to judge. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. We've looked at a lot of the linguistic areas that we can talk about, but I'd like to just for the last few minutes focus on the non-linguistic, the kind of human side of things. How many of you have heard of active listening before? And what does it mean to you? What is active listening? How is it different from just listening normally? Expressing interest. Yeah, so showing people that you're engaged, you want to understand what they're saying. Yeah, thanks for that. So it's engaging with the person. listening deeply, without thinking about your answer. Yes, so listening to understand. I heard it described recently as listening to understand and not to win, which I thought was great. So yeah, listening with more than your ears, listening with your eyes. Are people understanding you or not? Are people having difficulty expressing themselves? So listening, feeling what that person is trying to get across to you, not just listening with your ears. And also active means active. Ask. Yes, body language. Pick up the body language. Ask if you don't understand something. If you're listening and you don't understand what someone says, active listening is when you ask them what they mean, or you say, "Did you mean this?" and you rephrase the words, or you confirm understanding. That is active listening. So you're playing an active role in the communication. It's not all about shutting up and letting the words come to you. It's about engaging with the words and making sure that you understand them actively. And this is probably the most important part of Global English, active listening. And the other part is positive curiosity. So this is wanting to understand, and I think you've mentioned it in the chat. It's constantly working towards understanding. It's not being satisfied with not understanding. It's working together to form meaning and to communicate. It's understanding that you and me, we're in this together, and we are we're creating understanding together. It's not just a case of listening, receiving, speaking and producing. It's like a dance, if you like. And assume the best. How many of you have received an email that you read through very quickly and it made you really angry? Or you've had a quick response from someone that has shocked you? Have you ever had that before? Quite often in cross-cultural situations, the communication that people put out is not what they isn't received the way they intend it to be received. So always assume the best. That is a really important part of Global English. So assume that the person you're communicating with doesn't want to offend you. If you do get offended, that's probably not what they meant. Assume that they want to communicate with you as much as you want to communicate with them. So assume the best about the communication, and this will really make the communication flow more quickly. I'm conscious we're running out of time now, but I just wanted to skip ahead to ask you, based on what you have seen over the past hour, what we talked about, what's come up in the chat, how can we, as native speakers and as non-native speakers, communicate better with each other? And how can we help each other to communicate? After all, that's what Global English is about. It's about ensuring that we all understand. Ask, ask, ask. Yes, native speakers don't ask. So please feel free to fill in. And if you feel there's anything that relates to both, please put it in this box at the bottom. Feel free. So if you think it's not just the responsibility of the native speaker or the non-native, if you feel it's the responsibility of both, put it in the bottom. So ask, ask, ask could go in the bottom. Anything else that could come in here? Slow down and don't be afraid of silence. Yeah, I'm afraid I skipped through the piece about speed. Slowing down is important, but not slowing down too much that it's patronizing. Being aware of the people you're talking to, the pace that they're comfortable with, and fitting in with that pace. Quite often mirroring the pace of the people that you're talking to is a useful technique. Think twice. I mean, reconsider before you speak. Yes. Always think about the words that are coming out of your mouth. Too often, as native speakers especially, we don't think before we speak. We're thinking about content, not the channel, not the words. Yeah, enjoy. Yes, enjoy. That is it. That is very positive. Don't forget that we don't always follow you. Yes, that's very true. Very true. I want to finish on time, so just clicking forward to give you some of the things that have come up previously when I've spoken about this with mixed groups. Confidence, adaptation for natives. Yes, we've talked about that. Empathize, listen to understand and not to win. An open space for feedback. So native speakers, a good technique is to ask for feedback on how you're doing in your communication. Non-native speakers, give feedback. If you're not understanding someone, please give feedback. And be curious, be positive, and always assume the best. So I just wanted to wrap up with one final thought, and I'm sorry it's been a bit of a rush at the end there. But I'd like you to think of global English about as being about co-creation. It's not about transmitting the message from the speaker to the listener. That's not what it's about. It's about co-creating meaning. It's about you and me working together to create this atmosphere of understanding, this atmosphere where I can feel comfortable and safe using the language that I'm comfortable with, and you can feel comfortable and safe using the language you're comfortable with. Whether it's in a grammar book or not, we'll get there. We'll work together to ensure that we understand meaning. So English, global English, is all about co-creation of meaning. And I think that is everything. We don't have much time for questions, I'm afraid, but as Kathy said, I'm very happy to stay around and answer some questions if any of you would like to ask any.
Thanks so
or
much,
even add
Chris.
comments.
I think, yeah, we're really happy to stay, but obviously understand if people do need to shoot off. I think it just goes to show what a complex topic good communication and good use of language really is. And I think you've covered an awful lot of ground in a very short time. So thank you. Yes, we don't send the slides, we send a link to a recording, and you should get that tomorrow by email. So I can see some nice comments, so thank you for those. Yeah, and I agree with you, Scott. I think not only English teachers, but it's been interesting some of the comments that have come through around native speakers of English, and we only had a minority on the call. And I think, as someone said, you know, we're not necessarily aware when we're speaking in our own language that we need to adapt. And someone made the point that often if native speakers speak another language, they kind of get it a bit more, but those of us who are monolingual perhaps struggle. So yeah, there's a lesson there, I think, and perhaps we need to target our UK clients a bit more strongly with this topic to get them on side. Just looking, it doesn't look like there are any questions coming through. As we always say, if you have questions or comments afterwards, drop me a line or anyone on the team here. I think you know where we all are. And just to let you know, we do have some workshops coming up in September, really all around the theme of communication. I do a lot of our writing skills training myself, and one of the things we really try and talk about is using plain English. And I must say, with the Brits in the room, I normally get quite a lot of resistance. So it's an interesting take on the written side of communication. But we'll be emailing you about these as well. Oh, that's nice, Sandrine. We hope to see you soon. So yeah, if anyone has questions, drop me a line. I can always pass them on to Chris if I can't answer them myself. We'll be back in September for a final series of webinars towards the end of the year, so we'll be in touch about that as well. But otherwise, yeah, we've gone to. So thanks again, everyone, and we hope to see you again shortly. Thanks and have a great day, and thank you, Chris.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time.